You think this is funny, don't you? My mother's voice, usually a brittle chirp, had acquired a new, unsettling resonance. She stood in the doorway of my living room, silhouetted against the frantic, twinkling chaos of Christmas lights, and my stomach plummeted. The words weren't a question, but an accusation, laced with a venom I'd long since grown accustomed to but never truly digested. The air crackled, not with holiday cheer, but with the icy certainty that the illusion of normalcy was about to shatter, and my carefully constructed peace was already in pieces. For years, my life had been a study in controlled demolition. I lived in a beautiful, minimalist apartment, filled with art I'd curated myself, a testament to a success I rarely discussed. My career, in intellectual property law, demanded precision, a trait I'd learned to apply ruthlessly in all aspects of my existence, especially when it came to my family. They were a tempestuous ecosystem of need, obligation, and passive aggression, held together by my father's quiet resignation and my mother's insatiable desire for validation, which always seemed to translate into a deep-seated envy of my achievements. They saw my independence as a personal slight, my financial stability as a resource to be tapped, and my emotional distance as a challenge to be conquered, or, more often, exploited. Christmas was always their favorite holiday for this particular brand of subtle warfare, a time when the forced proximity amplified every unspoken grievance. There was the summer I turned 25. I just closed a major deal, the kind that cemented my reputation, and I was brimming with the quiet pride of accomplishment. My parents, visiting for the weekend, had spent the entire time lamenting their own financial woes. "It's just so hard, darling," my mother had sighed, dabbing at non-existent tears with a lace handkerchief. "Your father's pension isn't what it used to be. And you know how expensive things are now." She'd looked at me, a silent plea etched onto her face, and before I could even form a polite refusal, my father had chimed in, "A little help would go a long way, you know. Just until things pick up." The unspoken demand hung in the air, a loan, a substantial one, for a surefire investment my father had stumbled upon. I knew, with the chilling certainty of experience, that things picking up was a perpetual state of being for them, a promise that never materialized. I'd politely declined, offering to help with specific bills instead, a compromise they'd sniffed at before retreating into a sulky silence that lasted the remainder of their visit. The money, of course, was never mentioned again, but the subtle chill it introduced into our relationship lingered. Then there was the time I'd bought this apartment. It was a significant purchase, a culmination of years of saving and smart investing. My mother had insisted on visiting the day after closing. She'd walked through the rooms, her eyes darting from the high ceilings to the polished hardwood floors, a critical smirk playing on her lips. "It's nice," she'd finally conceded, her voice dripping with faint disapproval. "But are you sure you need all this space? It's an awful lot of upkeep. And what about taxes? Have you factored in the property taxes?" She'd spent an hour dissecting every aspect of my financial decision, not out of concern, but as if she were auditing my life. Later, at dinner, she'd casually mentioned how she and my father were thinking of downsizing their own home. "It's just too much for us now," she'd said, her gaze fixed on me. "Perhaps we could stay with you for a while. Just until we find something suitable. It would save us so much on rent." The implication was clear, my apartment was now a potential temporary housing solution for them. I'd learned to anticipate these veiled attempts at encroachment, these subtle tests of my boundaries, and I'd developed a quiet resolve, a steely inner core that refused to bend. The Christmas incident, however, was a new level of audacity. It was the 24th of December. Snow had fallen in thick, silent blankets, transforming the city into a hushed, ethereal wonderland. My apartment was warm, filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon, a stark contrast to the frigid tension that had been building between my parents and me for weeks. They were staying with me for the holiday, a tradition I usually endured with a carefully constructed veneer of politeness. This year, however, I had finally put my foot down about a particular topic, their persistent attempts to offer unsolicited advice on my career and, more pointedly, my finances. I'd made it clear that I had no intention of involving them in my professional life, nor would I discuss my financial portfolio with them. It was a boundary, firm and unyielding, and they had spent the lead up to Christmas subtly probing it, like sharks circling wounded prey. The evening had been a study in strain. Politeness. My father had retreated into his usual quiet, fiddling with his glasses and offering monosyllabic responses. My mother, however, had been a coiled spring of passive aggression. Every compliment she'd offered about my apartment or the meal had been backhanded. Such modern taste, she'd said, gesturing vaguely at a piece of abstract art. So different from what I'd imagined for you. And then, as I was clearing dessert plates, she'd dropped the bomb. She'd been sitting at the dining table, a half-empty glass of wine in her hand, her gaze fixed on the meticulously organized pile of mail on my credenza. "Oh, look," she'd said, her voice deceptively light. "Is that the new will from your solicitor? I remember you mentioning you were updating it." I froze, a plate slipping in my hand. It didn't fall, but the sudden jolt of adrenaline made my heart hammer against my ribs. "It's a document," I'd stammered, my mind racing. I knew immediately what this was about. The significant inheritance I'd received from my paternal aunt a few years prior, a sum that had grown considerably under my astute management, was the unspoken subject of every conversation, every veiled question, every simmering resentment. My mother had reached for it, her hand moving with a speed I hadn't anticipated. "Let me see," she'd commanded, her eyes glinting with an avarice that was both shocking and, disturbingly, familiar. "No," I'd said, my voice a low growl, cutting through the festive atmosphere. "You can't. That's private." Her face contorted. "Private? It's family money, dear. And we're your family. We have a right to know what you're doing with it." My father, usually the voice of reason, or at least the appeaser, had remained silent, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, his helplessness palpable. "It's not family money," I'd corrected, my voice dangerously calm. "It's mine. And my will is a private legal document that concerns only me and my appointed beneficiaries." That's when she'd stood up, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "You think you can just keep it all to yourself," she'd sneered, her voice rising to a pitch that pierced the quiet. "After everything we've done for you? After all the sacrifices? You owe us. And if you're not going to be reasonable, well, we'll just have to find another way." The implication, so blatant, so crude, hung in the air. They weren't just threatening to make my life difficult. They were threatening to dismantle the financial security I had built. The $11 million, carefully managed and steadily growing, was their new target. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just my parents, they were opportunists, and Christmas, the symbol of familial love and generosity, had become their battlefield. The twinkling lights seemed to mock me, the festive music a cruel soundtrack to my dawning horror. My carefully constructed peace had just imploded. The days that followed were a surreal blur. My mother's pronouncements echoed in my mind, a chilling promise of war. I didn't confront them further. I simply observed, my mind a cold, analytical machine. I saw the way my mother began subtly probing my father, coaxing him into conversations about our future and what's rightfully ours. I saw the way my father's usual gentle demeanor shifted, replaced by a flicker of shared, albeit misplaced, conviction. They had decided, in their minds, that my inheritance was an untapped resource to solve their perceived financial woes. Then came the phone call. It was from my father, his voice strained, his usual placidity replaced by a nervous urgency. He claimed my mother had been feeling unwell, a sudden bout of something. He needed me to come over, to discuss important family matters related to their finances and, implicitly, my inheritance. It was a trap, I knew, a carefully orchestrated attempt to corner me, to present me with a fait accompli. They wanted to use my supposed concern for their well-being as leverage. I didn't go. Instead, I made a series of phone calls myself. Calls to my lawyer, Mr. Sterling, a man who understood the intricate dance of family disputes and financial assets. Calls to the financial advisor who managed my portfolio. I explained the situation, calmly and precisely, detailing my parents' escalating claims and veiled threats. Mr. Sterling listened patiently, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of my emotions. He assured me that my inheritance was legally protected, shielded by trusts and legal agreements that were beyond the reach of familial entitlement. The final straw wasn't an outburst or a dramatic confrontation. It was an email. A few days after their health scare ploy, I received a curt, legally phrased letter from a solicitor I'd never heard of, claiming to represent my parents. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that they believed I had a moral and legal obligation to contribute a significant portion of my inheritance to their retirement fund, citing their past sacrifices and my current, excessive wealth. They were demanding a sum that was, frankly, obscene. It was a thinly veiled attempt to extort me, a blatant display of their greed. That was it. The quiet rage that had been simmering within me finally found its outlet, not in shouting, but in action. I didn't sleep that night. I drafted a response, not with anger, but with the cold, precise logic of a seasoned legal strategist. I meticulously outlined the legal fortifications surrounding my assets. I quoted clauses from my aunt's will, from trust deeds, from my own carefully constructed estate plan. I presented irrefutable evidence of their attempts at coercion and financial manipulation, including the chillingly worded email from their chosen solicitor. The next morning, I sent my response, not directly to my parents, but to their solicitor. Attached to it, however, was a separate, much shorter, and far more damning document. It was a scanned copy of the email from their solicitor, cross-referenced with an official record of their current substantial debts, which I had quietly obtained. I then sent a separate, very polite, but firm email to my parents, informing them that I had received their legal correspondence and that, in light of their aggressive stance, I had instructed my legal counsel to formally sever all financial ties and to initiate proceedings to ensure their access to any funds they might have been attempting to access through me was permanently blocked. The silence that followed was deafening. For 3 days, my phone remained blessedly quiet. Then, it erupted. Texts flooded in, not from my parents, but from aunts, uncles, cousins, the inevitable, flying monkeys, who had been conditioned by my mother's narrative of me as the selfish child. Accusations flew. How could you do this to your parents? They're old and need help. You're being cruel and ungrateful. My father's sister, a woman who had always been fiercely loyal to my mother, sent me a scathing message, calling me a heartless prodigal. My parents, realizing their direct approach had failed, were now attempting to weaponize the rest of the family against me. They were hoping a united front of familial pressure would force me to capitulate. But they had underestimated me. They had underestimated the meticulous planning, the legal expertise, and the sheer, unyielding resolve that my years of navigating their emotional landscape had instilled in me. Then came the real fallout. My parents' solicitor, faced with my overwhelming legal evidence and the sheer audacity of my parents' claims, withdrew their representation. News of my parents' failed attempt to seize my inheritance, and their subsequent public shaming within our extended family circle, spread like wildfire. The whispers turned into outright condemnation. My mother's reputation for manipulation and entitlement, long simmering beneath the surface, was now laid bare for all to see. They were ostracized. Their desperate attempts to leverage their hardship were met with cold stares and stony silence. Their social standing, which had always been built on a foundation of perceived victimhood and familial obligation, crumbled. Financially, their situation became dire. Without the specter of my inheritance to prop up their fantasies, their mounting debts became impossible to ignore. The surefire investment my father had supposedly fallen for turned out to be a Ponzi scheme, and the money they had somehow managed to scrape together from various sources had evaporated. They were left with nothing but their own entitlement and the wreckage of their relationships. I heard, through the grapevine, that they had been forced to sell their beloved, and frankly, rather dilapidated, family home, and were now living in a modest, rented apartment in a less desirable part of town. My father, the quiet enabler, was reportedly riddled with regret, while my mother, the architect of their downfall, remained defiantly bitter, her sense of injustice a poor substitute for the comfort of wealth. I don't regret my actions. I never will. The emotional justice wasn't in shouting, or in physical retribution. It was in the quiet, precise dismantling of their delusions, in the absolute and undeniable demonstration of my strength and their utter powerlessness. It was in watching their smug certainty curdle into confusion, then into panic, and finally, into the cold realization of their defeat. They had tried to steal from me, not just my money, but the very foundation of my hard-won independence. And in the end, they had only succeeded in revealing their own profound emptiness. The silence now, after the storm of family drama and their pathetic attempts at legal maneuvering, is a profound and absolute peace. It is the sound of my carefully constructed life, finally free from the corrosive influence of their insatiable demands.